Welcome back to The Social Workers on WCDB Albany.
We're back. I'm Catherine Zox, your social worker with a microphone, and you're listening to the Social Workers Radio talk show here at the University at Albany, co-hosting with Alyssa Lotmore. Our next guest is Barbara Smith. Barbara's an author, an activist, an independent scholar who has played a groundbreaking role in opening up a national cultural and political dialogue about the intersections of race, class, sexuality, and gender. She has edited 3 major collections about Black women. She was co-founder and publisher of Kitchen Table, Women of Color Press, the first U.S. publisher for women of color. Barbara served 2 terms on the Albany, and that's Albany, New York, Common Council, representing the 4th Ward from 2006 to 2013. And from the beginning of her first term on the Common Council in 2006, Barbara focused upon addressing violence and increasing educational opportunity for youth and families. She is a professor of public service here at the University at Albany School of Social Welfare. She has appeared on many documentary films and most recently including the Project Makers, Women Who Made America, and was also nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. So welcome to the show, Barbara. Nice to have you on this morning.
Thank you very much, Catherine.
Yeah, it's kind of difficult for us to choose what should we start out with first in terms of all the work you've done. And I guess maybe we'll let you take it from here. I know racism, feminism, and the gun violence. I mean, those are 3 major topics, obviously. And you've been very much involved in the Snug program here at the University, at the School of Social Welfare. So I'd like to talk to you about the Snug program. We've had several people on the show actually telling us and who have been involved in the program.
Well, Snug is guns spelled backwards, not a name I would necessarily have chosen as an English major, but in any event, it was started, the conversations about it started in New York State in 2008, to my knowledge. They may have been discussing it previously, but this was initiated by members of our state Senate, particularly Malcolm Smith, who was a senator at that time. And they were very interested in using the Chicago CeaseFire model, which is a public health model and is one of the most successful ways to intervene in the problem, the very difficult problem of gun violence that has come about that we've seen yet. It's a model that is being practiced all around the United States and also in other countries. It was started by an MD, Dr. Gary Slutkin, who had been working in third world nations fighting epidemics that often did not have any cure, like AIDS. So the only way that you could change the impact of diseases like that was through education and public health. You prevent the disease as opposed to cure the disease. So when he got back to Chicago, and I don't know exactly what year it was, probably about 15 or 20 years ago, he saw all this gun violence occurring, and he saw it as a public health problem and a disease, perhaps, metaphorically, that could be addressed using public health methods.
Well, Barbara, can you describe here in Albany specifically what is our program? I mean, I know it's modeled after the Chicago program.
Right.
But for instance, first of all, the incidence of gun violence here, and has it gotten worse? Is it, is it better since the inception of the program?
It goes in cycles. I think we've had a lot of gun violence incidents. Even recently, there was just a Snug rally. It's not exactly the right word, but there was a Snug presence. One of the things that the model requires you to do is that within 72 hours of shooting, whether it's a fatal shooting or not, the community is supposed to mobilize, come out, and deliver messages to all who surround them about violence not being acceptable. So as I said, it's cyclic. There's a situation that seems to have flared up between the city of Albany and the city of Troy recently, including during the winter when usually these incidents diminish. And that seems to be a factor in why we've had some increase in incidents recently.
So are we talking about gang violence? Or
not necessarily, but I just wanted to say that during the first year that Snug was in existence, based at the School of Social Welfare, because that was only true for the first year, which was the 2010-2011 year, the incidents of violence and homicides did indeed drop significantly. So it was, very clear that this new model was working in Albany, and it has made a tremendous difference. I live in one of the communities where violence occurs far too often. That is the community of Arbor Hill in Albany, and we've definitely seen diminishing incidents. Although, as I said, it goes in cycles.
What about numbers? Do we have numbers to attach it to?
I'm sorry, I'm not a numbers person.
Yeah.
I'm a word person, so I don't have any numbers for you.
I'm not a numbers person, but I wanted you to tell me.
Right, indeed.
Yeah, but okay, but I guess you're saying we're going in the right direction, and also, but who is who's perpetrating the violence? Well, the reason
I said it wasn't gang violence is that implies a level of organization and malice and a forethought. I think that the most troubling kinds of gun violence incidents often are those that are just very, very sporadic and spur of the moment. Something happens, somebody steps on somebody's shoes, somebody looks at somebody's girlfriend, and all of a sudden guns are drawn. And one of the problems is that guns are so available. There's always been conflict among humans. I'm sure you could tell me more about why that is than I could because of your field. But as a social worker, but the thing is, as I said, conflict has always been true of human communities, but the human communities did not always have easy access to firepower. And that's one of the things that we deal with. So the thing is, what would have been a knife fight or a fist fight 30 or 50 years ago is now a gunfight, and people are dying.
So there's more access to the guns that's what you're saying? There are more guns, and those who are involved in this also have more access to these guns?
Well, because of, we don't have really strong measures for tracking and keeping illegal guns out of our communities, and we know why that is. We have a very strong pro-gun lobby in this country, and they're very effective. Even after Newtown in Connecticut, Sandy Hook couldn't get anything through because for some reason they think that individuals need to have the firepower that people in combat in war-torn countries have. AK-47s are not about for anything except for killing other people. They're not for sport, they're not for hunting, they're not for self-protection, they are about annihilating. And as long as people can get access to those kinds of weapons and other kinds of weapons, we will have many problems. Another thing about the gang issue that you asked, though, as I said, gangs imply a strong level of organization. What I've been told about Albany is that we don't necessarily have that level of gang organization, which actually can be a prevention of violence in and of itself. Because the gangs are in business, they don't want to do things that are going to affect their bottom line, their economic bottom line, though illegal. And a lot of violence doesn't necessarily help them to do carry out their entrepreneurial activities. So, but as I said, we don't necessarily have that. We have a lot of young kids who don't necessarily have any affiliation with much of anybody. But they do have access to weapons.
And it does have such an impact. I mean, I was working as a school social worker in a middle school setting in Albany, and every time there was gun violence, the students would come in and they wouldn't even know how to express it. If one of their friends was injured or worse, and it went across the school, and you could tell how they were such a negative impact on them emotionally. They couldn't handle it. And as Snug is doing so much to not only raise awareness, but to also try to prevent some of these things from happening, which can help the students. I mean, when you're a middle school student, when you're even elementary school, but they were affected too. And I started at was working at Sheridan Prep way after the girl was shot by gun violence randomly.
You're talking about Katina Thomas.
Yes. And I remember I came in the year after that, and I was hired the year after that, and the students were still talking about it. They would still come down, upset. Wow, she should be in my class. She should be graduating this year, because I was working with the fifth graders at that time. So it's not something, I mean, this violence, it spreads to so many different areas, to so many different youth who don't really know how to process it yet. Right. But it's such a hard thing.
Right. And I think I've talked a lot about availability and quick-tempered decisions that leave people injured or dead. But there's also another part of it that you're reminding me of, and that I think is really important, and that is the community culture around violence and what is the right or wrong thing to do. I think that when you have free-floating free agents, these young people who have access to weapons, who've never been taught that other human beings are to be respected, if not loved, and that the feelings that you have about the people you care about, those other people have those same feelings. So if you harm one of the people who's important in their lives that they care about and love, or take them off the planet through homicide, you have to deal with the reality and the consequences of that. But there's not that kind of a discussion. It's about, if somebody does something that you feel is wrong to you, you've got to get them. Yeah. And you don't think about the fact that that individual who you, quote, get has a mother, a father, grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins, sisters, and brothers. You don't think about that.
And it's so hard to break that cycle as you're coming in as a school social worker, whoever, when there's a community behind that doesn't support that same message,
right.
you know, or, you know, if a parent comes in and says, no, that person hurt my child, this is what needs to happen.
They have a right, yes.
It's definitely mixed messages from students, and who are they going to listen to? Their parents or their community members, or the person at their school who they only see a short time
and who
from.
they don't think is necessarily like them.
Yes.
This person may not have much in common with them. They may like the person, that is, have fond and positive feelings about that person, but after all, at the end of the day, she's not from here. Yeah. She has a very different perspective. Yeah. When I was growing up back in the middle of the 20th century, I was told, as were many children who are my age peers, don't hit back. That was a message, don't hit back. In other words, we got a message at home that curtailed things escalating to an extreme level. And again, I'm not saying there weren't fights. There were fights. They were fist fights, and maybe someone had a knife.
Yeah. Was this the same message, Barbara, for you? I mean, as a woman, as for men or for the boys, or were there different messages?
I have no idea, because I have no male siblings. I have no idea. I don't think that, you know, like I did have some boy cousins, I don't think they were encouraged to fight either. I certainly have no impression that they were. And I don't have any recollection of them having been in fights. So... I mean,
it's definitely a different message now. Just like I said, from my experience in the school setting, the message is, if somebody does something to you, you do something back to them. And I've heard it from parents. I've had phone calls from parents and saying, you can't suspend my child for doing this because they were, you know, reacting with that person shouldn't have done that to them in the first place. So like when you have the parents saying that message to you too, it is hard to combat that.
One of the things that Snug did and still does is to curtail retaliations, because that dynamic that we're talking about, a lot of violence occurs as a result of the give back. You know, I'm going to give it back to you. And one of the things that we saw during that first year of Snug being in place here in Albany is that you didn't have the cycle of, like, a violent incident happens and then you have 3 or 4 just like that very quickly after them that were clearly as a result of the retaliation. So one of the things that the Snug workers do is to go to the hospital when a shooting occurs, and to interact with, if the victim is able to communicate, they interact with that victim, but they definitely interact with the family and friends of the person who has been shot, because it is often in the hospital where the retaliations are planned. So that's a very important aspect of what we do. And that hospital here in Albany would be Albany Med, because that's our level 1 trauma center.
And how do you pick those persons that are involved in the Snug program? I mean, what's the process for that?
Well, it's a very interesting process. And the qualifications for being a Snug are CeaseFire, which is now called Cure Violence. CeaseFire has changed its name to Cure Violence. But those qualifications are kind of the opposite of what people need in other lines of work. In other words, they want you to have had criminal activity in your background. They want you to know the streets. Often the people, I would say probably almost without exception, who are Snug staff have been incarcerated. And if not, they've definitely had a long an interesting history with law enforcement. But these are people who have that history and who have turned their lives around, who have come to an understanding like that was not the right way to do things. I'm very upset that I did things that way, and now I want to give back to my community because I see it's still going on. So, as I said, people who are very savvy about the streets, about the dynamics, and who are also credible messengers in relationship to those who are still involved in the violence.
That's not an easy pick. I'm sort of visualizing as you're telling me. I mean, actually, who makes the recommendation or the referral, or do they volunteer?
Well, the thing is, job announcements, of course, go out, but if things are the same with Cure Violence, and I suspect that they are in this aspect of the program, they're hiring panels. So no one individual, would interview someone and say, you're the person. It's about going through a very rigorous interview process, including people from Chicago and people in our community here, like someone in law enforcement, someone who works at a social service agency, someone who's a member of the community. So you face a panel. And since they've done the hiring process so many times, I'm sure the set of questions that they ask are questions that separate people out from, good candidates as opposed to ones that are not as well suited.
Have you received much resistance in regard to the Snug program? And if you have, tell us about it.
Not personally.
No.
I think...
yeah, not you personally necessarily, but maybe you personally, but just the program in general, yeah.
I hesitate to say what the resistance has been, because it's so not relevant to the content of the problem and the program itself. We can talk offline about what the resistance has been, and I'll tell you why I think it occurred and has occurred. I don't think there's a huge amount of resistance, but every so often there will be like kind of a flare-up of interest in what's going on with Snug, and people wanting to kind of get in there and call the shots. A bad metaphor, but you know what I'm saying. They want in, and the way they manifest that is to be critical of what already exists. Snug can't address every single aspect of what's going on in our community around violence. We need to have Snugs in all of the surrounding cities, but we don't, not to my knowledge. We certainly have other efforts, but the thing is, as usual, something that is incredibly valuable for our quality of life as people is what gets short shrift as far as funding is concerned.
Is there any other programs that go into communities, even when there's not violence, to sort of talk about those violence prevention in terms of, don't retaliate if something does happen? Is there something sort of more of the preventative that goes into communities and talks in sort of a casual format, or?
I think there's huge numbers of efforts using different strategies to deal with the issue of violence in our society, because let's face it, the United States is just horrific as far as the level of gun violence in particular that we have. And most people think that's because of the accessibility of guns. In societies, Western, European, similar industrialized societies that don't have the easy access to guns and don't have the kinds of laws that we have about everybody can have one, and you can take it to church, and you can take it to your college classroom, and you can take it to the movie theater. You can take it anywhere you want and kill people too. But the thing is, those societies have less gun violence. But as I said, there are efforts to try to diminish it. In many ways, to me, one of the best methods is restorative justice. I don't know if you're familiar with restorative justice, but that's mechanism where those who have done harm have to acknowledge the harm that they've done. They have to develop empathy and say what they think the negative thing they did to the people who experienced it and who are on the receiving end of it. And then another part of that process is to make amends by doing something positive in the community. So a restorative justice model is really very useful, because it's not a blame model, it's not a punishment model. It's a kind of like setting off a few light bulbs in people's heads and hearts about, oh, I never knew. And that's what I really like how you said that, but I was having a conversation the other day about sort of that lack of empathy with some individuals, and how they're not really processing what their actions are doing to other people and how it affects them. So I really like that you mentioned that, because it is something that
I've seen in my work, you know, I'm sure a lot of other people, I was talking to other social workers, are seeing that in their work,
Right.
that there's this disconnect with the emotions attached to certain acts that they're doing.
Right.
And how do you break that? How do you help someone develop those emotions and
Right.
develop the empathy and say, okay, this will affect this and these people. How do I not hurt them in that way?
And it should start the day you bring the baby home from the hospital. That's the day that should start. People love their own children, at least most people do, although we know that there is child abuse and other kinds of very tragic things that go on in families. But most people do love their children. But you have to be able to imagine, put yourself in the place of the person next door, the person across the street or down the block or on the other side of town. They love their children too. Do I want my child to be in a relationship to those other children that one day they take their lives? It's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. But there is a lack of empathy, I think. But one of the things I was going to say is that I think it comes from trauma too. Yeah. So the issue of trauma is really something that has to be looked at in relationship to value systems and how people interact with each other and what they are just kind of closed off from feeling, because trauma will breed people and psyches that just don't have the wherewithal to extend themselves beyond self-protection.
Especially trauma at such an early age. You're growing up. If there's violence in your community, if there's things going on in your family, that it impacts you. It impacts how you just turn off that emotion, because it's easier to turn it off than to feel all of that pain.
Right.
So
right, indeed. Yeah, we need a lot of resources to support our young people, to support our families, to have healthy and safe and vibrant communities. And that's why I decided to put my hat in the ring for Common Council.
You know, Barbara, you mentioned restorative justice and that there are programs for that, I assume, because that's something that you say is effective in terms of turning around this kind of behavior. So where are these other programs, or do we have examples?
Well, the thing is, there are actually whole cities. I'm going to say Australia, it might be New Zealand. I have a dear friend, John Coutreau, who has been a practitioner of restorative justice for many years, and their conferences, their books. I actually have been trained in restorative justice. There's a wonderful center in Rochester. I worked with New Yorkers for Alternatives to the Death Penalty for some years and was also a member of their board. And at one point when I was staff for New Yorkers for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, one of our other colleagues on staff said, all of you need to go get trained in restorative justice. So it was a tiny staff, but the thing is, the few of us, the three of us out of that small staff who had not been trained, we went to Rochester several years ago and got trained in restorative justice. But you can't consider yourself to be a practitioner just because you went through a few-day training. But as I said, my friend John Coutreau, who's been doing this for years, he has told us about the fact that there's some towns or cities in other parts of the world that are completely run with a restorative justice model. So it's a really important, I think, I'm glad I'm talking about it on your show and on a social work show, because any social worker should know about restorative justice. It's a really very vital and successful and effective way to deal with conflict among people.
Yeah, well, even just hearing it right now, I'm very interested in learning more about that. So
maybe you can get someone on who can talk about it more knowledgeably than I.
One other question about, because I keep going back to this, but who are you talk about gun violence and it's not gangs. And it's comes from maybe just having access to guns, and emotions get hot and people shoot each other because that's the culture. What about drugs? How do drugs come into play?
Well, I think drugs are definitely implicated in violence and gun violence. And I want to say too, when I say it's not gangs, I'm probably splitting hairs. Mm-hmm. There are crews. There's a distinction between organized gangs, like they have in Chicago and have had for decades in Chicago, versus crews or sets that have sprung up like in the last few years, ones that fade in and fade out. We do have some, as I understand it, affiliations with nationally known gangs in the city of Albany, specifically the Crips and the Bloods. But the thing is, we also have people who are not affiliated and who have other names, for their sets or their crews. The distinction I was making was between highly organized experienced and older gang leaders who are at the top of the leadership hierarchy of a gang versus teenagers who are part of a group in a neighborhood who do have a name and who have access to weapons, because that latter scenario is more dangerous in many ways, because there's no brakes. Nobody's putting on any brakes and saying, you know what, that's going to cause us too much trouble around our income and our drug trade at this particular geographic location. If you go and kill somebody over there, or if you mess with those people over there, it's going to cut into our bottom line. You don't have people saying that necessarily. Yeah. You'd ask me another question that I probably forgot.
And I probably forgot too. I tend to ask maybe 2 or 3 questions at once and pick the one you want.
Oh, you asked about drugs, and I think I did
yeah.
actually address that.
The drug. Well, we only have a couple minutes left, so, and I think we're just going to be doing violence in the Snug program today. We'll have to have you back for all the other topics that you are an expert on. But just one last thing, like now at your stage of the game, where is Barbara Smith going? What are you going? I mean, here you are. You've been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, which I have to say is quite impressive, amongst all the other things that I mentioned at the beginning of the show. So what's next for you in?
Well, it's not so much what's next. It's like, what am I doing now?
Okay.
Yes, I did not run. I served 2 terms on the Albany Common Council. The terms are 4 years long. And I did not run last year, which was an election year in the city of Albany. I was highly supportive of our new mayor, Kathy Sheehan, who is the first woman mayor of Albany, which goes back to, the times of the Dutch and wooden ships and all that. Albany's quite old, getting to be almost 400 years old. So Kathy Sheehan is our first woman mayor, and I'm very pleased and proud to say that I'm a part of her administration. I am the Special Community Projects Coordinator for the City of Albany. So I actually have an office in City Hall that I'll be going to in a few minutes. We had a transition team process that the mayor-elect put into place, and I was the co-chair of the Community Engagement and Empowerment Subcommittee. We had to submit recommendations, and much of my work is to implement the recommendations of the committee that I co-chaired.
Congratulations. Yes. Yeah, well, we'll keep an eye on you. Barbara, thanks so much for being on the show this morning. We really appreciate it. And we will have to have you back. This is our last show for the semester, and then we come back in the fall, and then you've got to come back with us. We'd really like to hear about the new mayor and what's going on. Yeah.
You're very welcome. I'm so glad that I could come today.
Thank you. We're going to take a short